So, ladies and gentlemen, let's turn now to Jim O'Connell, who began full-time clinical work with homeless individuals as the founding physician of the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program. That now serves more than 12,000 homeless persons each year in 2 hospital-based clinics. That's at Boston Medical Center and MGH, and also in more than 70 shelters and outreach sites in Boston. To deliver the thoughts from across the world, perhaps what works, what doesn't work, will you please welcome Dr. Jim O'Connell now.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And it's a huge pleasure to be here. This is about, I realize I think I've gone as far away from Boston as I can before I start going back. So I've never done that before. So it's my first trip to Perth, and I am thrilled to be here. I wish I could stay a little longer and enjoy it. But I'm laughing because your winter days are a lot like our summer days. So please don't, I don't want to hear any more about how cold it is, okay? This is nice. I would love to share with you, if it's okay. First of all, let me say thank you, because coming to Australia I have a close friend from when I was in school in Cambridge who lives in Brisbane and now on the Gold Coast, and I've been over a few times to get a chance to see what your country is all about. And it's coming from our part of the world, it's just refreshing, and to see how you all share things and how things you can think out of the box in ways that I think in our country we're too constricted. So it's been a treat for me to be here. I've been in Brisbane and Sydney and now Perth, and it's just a treat. So thank you for that invitation. I also have to really thank Barry Doyle and Jessica, wherever Jessica Bailey is for. There's Jessica, because I think I ran into Jessica last year, at the end of last year in Sydney, and I thank you for the invitation to be here, and to Gina for taking care of me yesterday through all sorts of radio stations and stuff like that. Thank you very much. And to Rebecca for setting everything up. But I'd like to share with you some of the stuff that goes on in Boston. And what I can tell you is lots of the things we've been doing for 30 years. This has been my full-time job for almost 30 years now. So lots of the things are spectacular failures. Many of the things I think are beginning to show success. And I think we have way more in common than we do not in common, even though we come from different parts of the world. And I'd love to, can I turn on do I have control of that? Right, like this? Perfect, let me just go here. So just to give you, and I only have 25 minutes, so I'm going to try to go quickly here. But in Boston, we have about the same number of homeless people as you have here in Perth. We have about 8,000 to 8,500 people that you can count on any given cold winter night, okay, which is something. We also have a very extensive shelter system, because shelters started in the early 1900s in Boston. This is Pine Street Inn. I just thought I'd show you. It's our oldest shelter, the oldest and largest shelter in New England. But, and it's where I began working in 1985. But it sleeps about 700 people in that shelter each night. There's also a shelter adjacent to it, which is about 150 women, which is also the largest women's shelter we have in our country. And that is only one of 2 or 3 big shelters in Boston. So we have big warehousing shelters for adults. For families, we have much smaller, and it's much smaller shelters in a very different system. But I'm going to talk just about the adults, if you don't mind, today. And this is the oldest picture I have. And you have to picture, talk about serendipity. So I didn't get to medical school until I was pretty late in life. As my mother keeps reminding me, I'm living my life backwards. But when I got to medical school at the age of 30, I got to Boston, went to Harvard Medical School, trained at Mass General Hospital, which is the hospital I still work at, so I've had a very myopic medical career. But when I finished, I wanted to become an oncologist. I was fascinated and challenged by the care of cancer and people with cancer. And I got pulled into the office late in my last year, just before I was about to go to New York to a place called Sloan Kettering for a couple of years. And my chief of medicine said, you know, there's a new grant. Homeless people are coming to the emergency room in droves. This is late 84, early 1985. And there was a grant given to the city of Boston to try to integrate the care of homeless people into the mainstream of the healthcare system. The real goal was to get out and care for people before they came to the emergency room. That was the driver part. So I got called in and got conscripted to be that person. I sort of resentfully accepted it, decided I'd do it for a year and then move on with the rest of my life. And as all of you are here, I'm sure know, it's hard to get involved in this and not get caught. So I got them to delay my fellowship for a couple of years after that, and then after that it just was not to do. But here's what was strange. I finished, my last job at the hospital was to be the senior resident in charge of the intensive care unit. And we had people flying all over the world, from all over the world, really sick, and my job was to manage and understand what was going on. And you feel at the end of all that training, 7 years of training, that now you're getting pretty good, okay? And you get this incredibly inflated sense of ego. But you're also proud of, God, I put through all this. We had, it was every other night in the hospital for 7 years. It was a lot of work. So anyway, I went down to the shelter. I finished the ICU, and the next day I was in the shelter starting my new job. And I walked in thinking, I'm the first doctor to work in the shelter. I'm sure they're going to be thrilled. I can't wait to get started. And I walked into a nurse's. Are there nurses here, by the way? I hope so. Okay, great. Because I owe most of my career to the nurses who have shown me what to do. But I walked in thinking, they're going to be really happy, and the nurses sat me down in this little chair and told me, look, we've been doing this for a very long time without the help of doctors or hospitals, thank you very much. So they made me sit down, and I had to soak feet for 3 months, okay? So remember, I'm coming from this ICU where everything's high-tech, things are flying all the way, and I'm now soaking feet. And the point was a lesson that I've tried to grab onto that you all know, but I did not at the time, and that's that nothing happens in the world of a homeless person unless you can take the time to engage them, to earn their trust, and to be present. And the nurses were just trying to say, look, in fact, I couldn't use my stethoscope, I couldn't ask questions that were like, are you hearing voices, are you having chest pain? Not allowed. I just had to soak feet and ask if there's anything else you can do. So this was a man who, the very first picture I ever had that somebody took for me, and my job was to soak his feet. I had seen him a million times in the emergency room at Mass General, and we called him, in the chart, a paranoid, schizophrenic, treatment resistant. I remember we used to be able to put that in the chart. And he was a delightful guy, but he had no interest in doing anything we said. And his legs are always infected, so he was coming in with these horrible infections. We were trying to treat those, but he would walk out and never do what we said. So I soaked his feet, and for about 6 weeks, he didn't say anything to me. He looked at me with that wry smile, and one night he looks down and he says, hey, thought you were supposed to be a doctor. First words he ever said to me. And I was like, oh God, somebody acknowledges I'm a doctor, thank you. And I said, I am. And he goes, well, what the hell are you doing soaking feet? And it was hard to negotiate that. I didn't know what to say, except I just do whatever the nurses tell me. But about a week after that, he asked me, he said, Doc, I can't sleep, so can you give me anything to help me sleep? That was him asking me. And so in those days, I gave him a little bit of Haldol, which is haloperidol for those of you who are in medicine, which is both a pretty good sleep medicine, but also a slight antipsychotic. And so he took it, and a couple nights later he said, great, Doc, that helped, but only let me sleep a couple hours. Can you give me some more of that? And to make a very long story short, that was the beginning of him asking for the very medication we could never get him to take in the emergency room. And so after 25 years on the street, and I can't tell you how many emergency rooms, hospitalizations, all that, about a month or two after that picture was taken, he was in a group home for the Department of Mental Health, taking his medicine, actually having a really good quality life. He died about 5 years ago of cancer. But it was the stark lesson I had to learn, which you all know, but when you train in medicine, and be patient with the docs and everybody else, we train, you have to see people in 10 minutes, you have to get to the chief complaint, you have to diagnose, you have to treat, you have to move on. It does not work in our world. So much of what we've had to try to learn in Boston is how to go back to an older style of medicine that looks at all sorts of dimensions. Anyway, and I'm going to narrow down my clinical life to this day is still taking care of people. We have 3,000 shelter beds in Boston for adults. You can be sober or intoxicated, doesn't matter, you can come in, so everyone's welcome. But there's a group of people that then stay outside. You have to remember, we have cold weather. I mean, this is not cold. We have weather that's like, this winter time, I don't think once the temperature got above 0 degrees centigrade, okay? Not once during the entire winter time. So people live outside. The ones who do not come into the shelter are a fascinating subgroup of the homeless who I believe teach us all the weaknesses in our healthcare and other systems long before you realize it if you're taking care of other people. So this is the people that we call the rough sleepers, as you do in there. And this is Keisha, who's a woman who lived under the Longfellow Bridge, which is a bridge across the Charles River, which spans Boston to Cambridge, Mass. And she lived there for a long, long time. She suffers from everything. She has hepatitis C, she's got terrible AIDS, diabetes, and she lived under a bridge. And is just a delightful woman. She was addicted to several different substances. And she took this picture, okay, with a throwaway camera in about the year 1999. Okay, and it's a picture which, I'm sorry it doesn't project very well for you, but it's about 11 or 12 men. There is one woman there who's hiding because she didn't want to be the only woman in the picture. But it has struck me and it kept with me, and any of you who've done Registry Week or talked to Becky Kane, she uses this picture a lot. But she took that because that was her community. Those were her friends, the people she depended on. And it happens to be taken in a park that's on the grounds of my hospital, Mass General Hospital. So you can't tell, but just behind here is the hospital. So they're very close to a pretty good healthcare system, okay? And we like to brag about MGH, but it's pretty good. The other thing is, unlike most states, everybody in that picture has health insurance. So we have a lot of problems in our country. It's a horrifying disgrace that we have many, many millions of people without insurance. We're trying to rectify that now. But in the state of Massachusetts, they've done a great job. All of these people are insured. So the issue is not being close to health care or not having access to health care because they have insurance. However, when I look at that picture, and I can tell you the stories, the elaborate stories of all of those people. If you look at them, their average age is in the mid-30s. They all look pretty healthy, pretty robust. But there is only one of them still alive today. Okay, and when we've looked now carefully at rough sleepers, at least in our city, and looked at larger numbers, they're part of a bigger group we've been looking at. They have the highest crude mortality rate of any subgroup we know in America, bar none, okay? And they are literally in the shadows of our best healthcare institutions, okay? Now, to tell you what we've learned about this, we have been to get to those people because they won't come in to us. So the rule is you've got to go to them. You've got to get the clinicians to them because if you wait for them to come to you, it's going to be when they're really sick. Okay, they have too many competing priorities. So this is a van that goes out every night in Boston that's funded by the Department of Public Health. And it brings soup, sandwiches, and blankets to people 7 nights a week from 9 at night till 5 in the morning. And everyone who come to you, it's going to be when they're really sick. Okay, they have too many competing priorities. So this is a van that goes out every night in Boston that's funded by the Department of Public Health. And it brings soup, sandwiches, and blankets to people 7 nights a week from 9 at night till 5 in the morning. And everyone who's on the streets knows this van. It's run by these folks who are my heroes. They are people that were, many of whom have experienced homeless themselves. A lot of them are in recovery or still struggling. But they know folks on the streets and they never judge. They're really fabulous. And so they're out, and I have piggybacked on Mondays and Wednesdays since 1986. I've been riding on this van, and it's my way to get to know people outside. It's really, really fabulous. So it's like people sleeping in the snow on a bench. This is in the main park in Boston. This is a guy who, I throw that picture in there for humility's sake, because we've been seeing him for about 25 years, and he will not speak to us, and we can't figure out how to make a contact with him, so there's still many challenges. Don't let me think that we've fixed this. But then I've had now the privilege of working in a team, and this is where I submit that if you take care of very marginalized people, sometimes you learn how your healthcare system doesn't work very well. It may be a little bit akin to the justice system, as the Chief Justice was just saying. So what we've had to learn is that we have to look at the people outside as our panel of patients, as if a GP, you're in the registry of a GP. But on this picture, on the left is Jim Bonner, who's our psychiatrist, so he's full-time on our team. He's next to Romy, who's one of our what we call community health workers. And Romy's Cuban-American, speaks several languages, and just is really good about taking people on the street. Dave in the sweater is another internist like myself. I do internal medicine, by the way. And then Suzanne is our nurse practitioner. Next to him, and in the scrubs, is our nurse and myself. And so our job is to share in the care of people who live outside. Okay, and to try to sort of mitigate that horrible crude mortality rate. So we do things like go out and we see people. We have the nighttime rounds on the van, and then during the day, 4 days a week, we just go out and try to find people. And this is rounds. I'm sorry about this picture was taken by somebody else, but the reason I like this picture is it shows that I have the advantage, which I've never thought I could do, is I work side by side with a psychiatrist and with the nurse practitioner, and the social worker. So you are all together. You don't have to refer people to another system. We're all right there. So if a homeless person wants to see them, they're there. And that has been magic for us. Our whole healthcare system is moving that way now. So the traditional silos of mental health care over here and medical care here and substance abuse over there are starting to evaporate at long last in our system. And I think caring for homeless people has been a leader in that. This is Dave just trying to win over this person who was staying out in a snowstorm. Turns out, for those of you who know medicine, he has a hemoglobin A1C of 18, which means he has diabetes beyond out of control. And we're trying to lure him in. And the only way we could get him in was by bringing him stuff each day and then sort of slowly luring him into our McGinnis house. We also learned that when you go out to care in the street, this is a little aside for most of you who are not in healthcare, but we used to think of it as first aid and episodic care. And this is Jill, who's our physician assistant, who also has worked with us for 10 years. But she and Suzanne, our nurse practitioners, challenged us a little bit to say, what's so sacred about what you do in the exam room that you can't do outside? Turns out, you know, I was surprised because I protested this a little bit, but about 90% of the stuff you do in the exam room, you could do easily outside, okay, with a little bit of privacy. So we've learned we get everybody their immunizations. This is flu shot season. We give everybody who's on the street a flu shot, but you just have to go up and give it to them. There's a story behind this picture because the other advantage of a team is that Pat, who's standing there, one of our doctors in the past, had tried to ask this guy about 15 times if he would take his flu shot, and he said, not in your life. Jill walks up and goes, hey, sweetie, can I give you a flu shot? And he goes, oh, sure, and puts it down. So Pat is guffawing there, as you can see. The other thing we learned is that technology is sometimes subtly important on the most crude levels. So this is a man who had been in 6 emergency rooms being treated for scabies. I'm sorry about the clinical picture, but it's not a terrible one here. But, and it looks a little bit like what we call Norwegian scabies, but he had been treated, he was furious with the system, nobody helped him, and he wouldn't now come out from under his bridge. But he did let us take this picture, and I was a little worried because you can't tell this, but he's got all these nodules around his neck, which doesn't make sense with scabies. Everything else looked like scabies. So this was the first time we actually took a picture and emailed it to a dermatologist at Mass General, who's Ernesto Gonzalez. He's the chief there, and he said, if you ever have any pictures, just send them to me, and I'll tell you what's going on. And dermatologists can tell 95% of the time with accuracy the diagnosis if you have a good picture, okay, which blew my mind. So he wrote back. He had been a teacher of mine when I was at school. He gave me one of those harumph emails, like we went over this. And it turns out that's what's called nummular psoriasis. I did not know that. If any of the doctors in there knew that, I salute you, but I did not. And he told us what to do to treat it. And this was it after a couple of weeks with no emergency room visits, just giving somebody medicine under a bridge. So it was the first time we started to realize you can do a ton of specialty care in very unusual ways, okay? But the one thing we also learned is that people who live outside, as I'm sure all of you know, and these are the very most chronic of the homeless folks, and in our city, those who are really still too impaired to even be able to go into a shelter where there was a bed for them. And so we needed a hospital base. This is Mass General Hospital, sort of a slightly older picture. We have a clinic every day there, because part of what the community insisted we do is have a clinic in the hospital so when people get sick, we could still take care of them when they're in the hospital. And homeless people, as all of you know, spend an awful lot of time in the hospital with major medical issues going on. So we have a clinic there on Thursdays, which we dedicate now to, the other days it's a regular clinic, but on Thursdays we dedicate it to the street folks. And this is Mary Ann taking vital signs in there, and we have a special waiting room. The hospital's fabulous about this, because this is kind of, you know, the people are a little bit unruly and kind of colorful and sort of, you know, it's a little bit tricky. Sometimes you have to play a lot of things. But I don't know if it projects very well, but I took this picture, was showing it to some medical students, and they actually pointed out to me that somebody's sleeping under the table. I don't know if you can see the person with the thing sleeping under there. So you get the flavor that it's a really unusual waiting room, okay? But it's a place where we've been able to have students and volunteers and people to help us. We see about 80 to 100 people every Thursday morning, all street people, all of whom I once would have bet you $100 would never come to a clinic at the hospital, okay? And it turns out they come in droves for 2 reasons. The main reason is they come because it was Suzanne who saw them on the street, or I saw them on the street, and you say, come see me. Okay, they don't care that it's Mass General, they just come to see the person they know. And the second thing is it's a place to come in for the warm, and we have coffee and donuts and meals for them. So it's a little bit like a safety place. We've had trouble with flow through the clinic, because if we try to see somebody quickly and get them out, they're really upset because they'd much rather have you see everyone else, and they'll wait for 3 hours rather than not. So we've had to sort of get the hospital to understand we're slowing things down, not trying to speed it up. And our psychiatrist, Jim, has no place to see people, so he sees them in the cafeteria, which has turned out to be really wonderful because people don't like to go to something that says mental health or psychiatry, but they're happy to have a cup of coffee and chat in the cafeteria. And then we have these characters that I just share with you. This is a couple that wanders around the country. We don't have many people that wander around all the time, but these are unique. And I love it. Wherever they go, whatever city they've just come from, they're usually in the garb of that city. And they had just come from somewhere down in the south, and they had all these kind of colorful clothes on. We would get calls from New Mexico sometimes. They were there, and they needed their medicines refilled. Next time, be Washington State. And then they came in during a hot summer day wearing these clothes. For those of you who are not like Davy Crockett aficionados, this is the coonskin caps, you know, from raccoons that they had in, and they had spent the winter in Tennessee and decided to come to Boston wearing their clothes. I got a call from him, from his wife actually, about a month ago, where he had just gotten pancreatic cancer and died. They were living in a little campground down in South Carolina. But they stayed in touch, even though they went around the country, stayed in touch. And then, just to give you the sweep of a little bit of what the Chief Justice was talking about. So this is two people that I've known for a long time, the two men who grew up in real abject poverty. And Greg on the left, I met when he was living under a bridge when he was 14. He was living there with his mother and his sister. I tried to lure him in because he was really sick and he had a dense stutter. He couldn't speak very well, and every time he got excited, he would just stutter. And as a result, he was always getting laughed at and always getting in fights. And so he was known as a troublemaker. He was always in trouble. When we finally got him in, we realized that when he wanted to call his sister, I gave him the phone and said, go ahead, please call. And he couldn't read the numbers. He didn't know how to read anything. And I'm looking, oh man, there's this poor kid who's been under the bridge for all this time, can't read or write, has never really had anything together. And when we did sort of formal testing, his IQ was about 48, which is very, very low. So here's a poor kid that had been dealt a horrible hand in life, never got the services he needed, and then ends up under a bridge, and we think of him as a criminal, okay? But even worse, his buddy Billy, who we still follow both of these guys, when he was 5 years old, he was in his front yard in a corner in Boston in 1968, right after the assassination of Martin Luther King, which we were talking about last night, and some people poured gasoline all over him. He's 5 years old and lit him on fire. So he's you can't tell, but from the neck down, he's completely burned. Spent years in the hospital, multiple surgeries. He also has an IQ that's about 50 and never learned to read or write. He has AIDS, he has diabetes, he's about to go on dialysis. He's got every medical problem you can imagine. And somehow they both can still smile. I have no idea how. But those are people, if you walked by, you would say, homeless people, you'd sort of give them a disparaging look. When you understand their stories, it's just breathtaking. And then the other end of the spectrum is this man who we had been on the streets for 50 years, the man on the right. I can tell you about both, but let me tell you about the man on the right, who told me he would never talk to me about anything, just would say, hey, I was the youngest professor ever at Columbia University. We hear this a lot on the street, didn't know what to think of it. And he would never come in to let me do anything medical, but he would talk philosophy and English with me. And I was a philosophy major in undergraduate and graduate school, so I figured I'd catch up my new philosophy. But I couldn't. I would ask him. He said he was at Columbia in the early 1950s, which was when the Beat generation was just starting. There was a flourishing of philosophy then, and there was Van Dorn and several other people, including Ginsberg. So I'd ask him about those people, and he would tell me not only about their philosophy, he'd tell me about their wives, their mistresses, what they were doing. And I started thinking, man, what's going on here? And he then one day came in and he, I asked him one time about Jack Kerouac, because Jack Kerouac was a hero of mine. And he said, he said, yes. He was a dashing young man. He said, but a terribly shallow thinker. Just cut me to the quick. But anyway, one day he got very sick. And by the way, when he would come into the clinic, he wouldn't let me do his vital signs. I couldn't do anything. I just talked to him, and I would just try to win him over. And we did that for like 10 years while he lived on the streets. And he finally got sick, and he came in. At least he trusted me when he got sick. We brought him upstairs, admitted him, and the residents were saying, okay, doc, and I'm an attending physician there. What's his blood pressure been? I said, I don't know. I've never taken it. And that's talking about getting, getting dinged. That looked like I was the worst primary care doc in the world. But it turned out they Googled him, and I'd never thought to Google back then, and he was, in fact, the shining young star of the Beat generation. He was, at the age of 16, a professor of English and philosophy at Columbia. His father was a judge, actually a chief judge in New York State. He lived on Park Avenue in New York, and he had his first schizophrenic break when he was 19. So he had this ascendant career, had a schizophrenic break, and then was on the streets of America 52 years before we sort of found him. And then, we got him together with his family. This is him with his family, and his sister is 84 years. He was 82 at the time of this. His sister is 84, and his brother-in-law is the editor of the New York Review of Books. So it was actually a really nice story, but they lost him for 52 years, okay? And think of that. He was probably the smartest man I've ever run into, and was on the streets that way. Another long story, but I got to stop here because going back to these folks, these are part of a group of people that live on the streets of Boston. We've learned that half of them die within 7 years, okay? At the same time that they come into the emergency room. This is just 119 of them, who in a 5-year period had 18,000 emergency room visits to our hospitals, okay, that's like living in the emergency room, basically, okay. And remember, 50% of them now die, so they're coming to us in droves. We're not treating them very well, and they're dying. So, and I can give you lots of stories. The last thing I wanted to finish with, and have I got a minute or no? I have 1 minute. Okay. So I wanted to share because people have asked me about where, some of you may know about this vulnerability index. It has been a sort of a interesting thing in our lives. But this is a picture we took of Stephen Wang, whose last name is W-H-A-N-G. For any of you who may know, he's one of the leading researchers on homelessness now. He's in Toronto. But when he was training, he worked with us after he finished at Johns Hopkins, he worked with us for about 6 years. And this is him out at one of the shelters where a man was deaf and he had figured out how to talk to him through his stethoscope. And I love that picture because the man who never could hear anything was like, oh my God, I can hear it. And Stephen is creative like that. But he did a study with us back in the early 1990s, which was looking at deaths among homeless people. And I won't go over that now, but what he did do, which was really brilliant, was had us review charts of people, homeless people who died, there were 600 of them, and then we matched them to homeless people who didn't die. And what we learned is what were the relative risks. So if somebody's walking into your clinic, who's really likely to die, okay, and what you have to watch out for. And we weren't surprised by it. It was kidney disease. AIDS was at that time, we had no treatment for AIDS. It was 50, if you walked in with AIDS, you were gonna die. And then we had a whole list of things that became relative risk factors for dying. The most surprising one is if you had in your chart a history of having had frostbite or hypothermia, you were 8 times more likely to die than a homeless person who didn't have that. So we did that study, and there was another study that came after an outbreak of deaths where we looked at who was dying on the streets. And from those 2 studies, we came up with a list of who we were really worried about, concerned about as clinicians. Now, all these were chart reviews, okay? We didn't go out and ask people. We did it through charts. They were our patients. And it was those studies, I think, that Common Ground, which is now Community Solutions, used to set up a vulnerability index to see who was at, and it's technically a mortality index rather than a vulnerability index. But it's been taken to another level that we did not do any of that. Just wanted to show you, those were the background studies for doing that. And I'm going to end by saying what we've realized, as all of you know too well, that working as a doctor in Boston with a really wonderful group, we have 17 full-time doctors now, 40 nurse practitioners, and it's our job. It's our profession. We have 15 nurses. And in trying to take care of homeless people, we've learned that you can only do that in a team setting because continuity is so important. And you can only do it with the people. We have to work with the police. You have to work with the shelters. You have to work with the housing people. And now the name of the game for us is how do you manage getting these folks who've been out there forever, who are very vulnerable, into housing. And all of the creative housing programs that I've been seeing and hearing about are kind of where my mind begins to salivate, okay? And getting folks into housing is really the name of the game. And if I had a lot of time, I could share you, these are stories of people that were on the streets for a long, long time. On our board of directors, we have several people who are homeless themselves, and they gave us, when we thought we got people into housing, we'd let, they could get into the mainstream health systems, but they said, wait a minute, if you've been their doctor for 20 years, just because they get into housing, you can't just abandon them. So we now spend, as a street team, we spend about half our time visiting people who have been housed. And now we're learning all the complexities that happens when somebody's been on the streets for a long time gets placed into housing, the different settings of housing, the different services. All of you know all too well that you have to provide for people. We used to think you could do a lot up front and then back off, but we've learned you have to do a lot up front and then maybe a lot later on. It goes up and down like that. So I'm here to learn with you, what is the stuff we need to do? Housing is clearly the necessary, but I don't think sufficient part of the solution. I think reform in the justice system, reform in the education system, all of those are going to be what we all have to get together and work on. I wish I had more time, but I'm going to stop here because I am over time. I can see I'm getting the idea here. So thank you very much, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Dr. Jim, I don't think that there's a person in this room who wouldn't want you to continue for the next hour in so many ways. Thank you for your stories, for personalising it, but for your passion over 30 years to make a real difference. You are a true inspiration. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I know you're going, no, but you are.